All right, everybody, welcome to the recommendation report video. We're just going to go through a process that you can use to write your recommendation report. It's going to draw on your textbook upon a student sample or two and upon just a little overhead as well here that I've got on the screen currently. So let's go ahead and get started. Flip to chapter 19 of your textbook. The one thing I can say about this, let me get the right thing here. Here it is. We've got some nice stuff on page 501 through 503 to kind of get you started, give you the background. You should have read through this already, but you can revisit it. Here's something on the writing process. But the main thing we can start to think of that gives you the format of a recommendation report, which is essentially problem solution, is this little grid here. And this is going to help you figure out what to say. And mainly the big things that all your information can stick to. What is the problem? Well, once you know what it is, everything that you talk about will be part of the problem or part of the solution. And so you can see once you've got options to solve your problem, we can then put that into the conclusion section, and eventually you choose an option, and that becomes at the end here, your recommendation section, right? And so you can see this whole little grid here outlines the types of information that you'll create from your sources. You got your sources from your research, you got your interview, and so it'll all be gridded out here along here. So this might be handy along the way to look at. I think the thing to do, though, we've got determining the options and the criteria. So here's a nice location in your textbook to give you, a visual grid of these things and some thinking. This is all fantastic and read through it, and I'm going to try to simplify it a bit by going here. And so here's, if we want to give this some context for our class, here's what it might look like. What are your criteria? We got to choose some criteria first, right? The criteria are probably the sort of smaller components of the bigger problem that you're addressing. Remember, in this assignment, you're addressing a communication problem in a field. It has to do maybe with a workplace culture or just how activities and operations work in a certain field. And it influences people or changes the way people behave, but also changes, more importantly, the communication. And so there's better or worse. And so you're being asked to sort of find a problem and then solve it. Now, you might already have from your sources in your interview the problem and the solution, and that's fine. You've got the problem and solution ahead of time. Should make writing this pretty easy, right? So you don't have to invent a new wild problem necessarily. You just need to locate a potential one that the field may have already solved, and that would be fine. Then just write that up into a report. But so what are your criteria? Well, if we think about the Anson and Forsberg article and the article that I wrote, it was on what happens when college graduates or just new employees enter a new organization, a new employer. And so there are many things that came up in those articles. Here's 4 that we could just pick out and say, here's my criteria that are the 4 components of my problem for this recommendation report. So if I was going to write a report the way that all of you are writing a report, I might choose these 4. Remember, the amount of oversight or feedback from a supervisor is usually pretty low compared to that you get in college, and that created problems for people. That could be one of my criteria. It creates a problem, and as long as I solve this, great. That would be part of my recommendation for a recommendation report. Open lines of questions and the availability of the supervisor were also a problem. Notice I grouped these 2, which had to do sort of with direct correspondence with the supervisor. I grouped those as 1 and 2 because they kind of seem to have something to do with each other, right? They group nicely. And maybe the 3rd and 4th criteria that I chose, you don't need to have 4, you could have 2 or 3, probably no more than that. These 2 have to do more with company culture and project goals, things that go beyond the supervisor. Updates and understanding of company culture produced a lot of problems for new employees and recent college graduates, as did ongoing changes and reactions to projects and project goals. As project goals changed, as they talked to another business and whatever was being done changed, well, the new employees didn't adjust very well, and the experienced employees did because they were used to such things. And so, for my report, I might pick out these 4 things from my research and my interview and say, hey, this is it. These are the 4 little problems that make the big problem, right? And so these will be your criteria, whatever they are in your project. You'd want to state those pretty clearly If we look for just a second at a student example, I think I got it here. This is Marcia's, the one on risk communication. It's just a rough draft of Marcia's here. It doesn't have everything in it that you would want, but even in her rough draft, you'll see she's got some of the basic features that you'll want. This is a good one to look at to model your own in terms of organization. You'll notice that she's got her 3 criteria right here in bullet points. Poor accessibility to readers, use of imprecise, legalistic language, etc., etc. So she's got her 3 criteria. Everything that she talks about in here is either going to be a larger explanation of how and why these are a problem, or she's going to start to solve these 3 small problems, which is to then solve her big problem in her recommendation. So that's how the criteria work. You'll need to find yours through your research, right? Once you do that and you've explained why they're a problem, which is the major portion of the first half of your paper, you've got your research section, your method section, results. Your results would really be explaining the problems, elaborating on the problems, your criteria. You then get into drawing conclusions. So what I might recommend here, and your book's going to have a lot to say about this as well, and you can read through your book. I would say for drawing conclusions, and this is of course in the conclusion section now, your report should resolve what the biggest problems are and answer how and why they happen. You've done a bunch of that back in the initial body of the report. As you move into the last 2 sections, the conclusions and the recommendation, the conclusions now, you're going to give the basic how and why they're happening. Here's what the 4 problems are again, 1, 2, 3, 4, or for you maybe 2 or 3. And here's how and why they are happening. As soon as you do that, then you can start to move into the other part of the conclusion, which is to build options. This is something that Marcia's paper does not have in it because it was a rough draft. She hadn't decided on all that yet. So be careful not to just copy the student papers that you see. You've got to use what the textbook says as well. So options, what are the courses of action? I'm asking that in this report you have at least 2, one of which is your actual recommendation. The other one is an option that could solve all or some of the problems, but you don't think it's the best option. You're going to describe it though anyway. You're going to say option 1 or plan A or whatever it is. Maybe it's an option that better addresses, supervisor availability. And so it solves 1 and 2. We need supervisors that give better feedback. Supervisors should be trained to give better feedback, that closer to that, professors give in college or something like this. They should be around in their office more, maybe have office hours, kind of like professors do in college. But if that's all it did, of course, it would come up short on company culture and explanation of project goals. So that option wouldn't be the best one necessarily. So then you'd need to come up with an option that solves all of these. So it isn't just the supervisor being around more, but how is the company going to handle explaining company culture and project goals. That might be something that the supervisor alone can't do. Maybe that means the vice president needs to stop by, or they need to have meetings with more than just the supervisor, so one-on-one won't work. And I would need to suggest here, for my best option, a small team of people talks about changes in project goals or company culture or something like that. And that would work pretty well then. So what you'll do, once you lay out your options, you will analyze each option according to the criteria. And, as I just pointed out for my fictional example, maybe one option really meets well 2 of the criteria, but less well the other 2. And then, of course, you're going to have another one in your conclusion section that is your good option that meets all 4, and you'll explain why it meets all 4. And after that, then, you're pretty much done with your conclusion section, and you can make your nice, clean recommendation. Here's the one thing that we recommend, plan A or plan B, I guess, if we're thinking of you having 2 options, right? And you'll explain that and why it's the best option. And so that should work pretty well. That is the long and short of it. You'll see that Marcia is doing a lot of that. She's also doing the other things in here. Here's her cover page. You do need an abstract. Your book discusses how to write these things. We'll talk about that in a minute. All right. I believe we left off with me just kind of walking through the organization for this. So title page, you'll need an abstract. There's really great guidelines and checklists on how to write these things in the textbook. So just use those and use the models here. Again, Marcy's I'm going to suggest as a rough draft is a little underwritten. One that you might also use that I'm kind of a fan of is Aaron's here from a few years back on crowdfunding. This is also located on D2L. And his has a bit more information in it, as you can see, but also follows the basic template. The other thing I'll point out is every once in a while, although you have this template, you're going to come across a few things that come up in your material that don't fit nicely into the template, and you're going to have to figure out where to put those. One that comes up in Aaron's is key terms right here. These are important, vocabulary words people needed to know. You could put them in a glossary in the back. He decided to put his here, and I think that works fine. He's teaching his people, the words they need before they go into the body of this, which is really, really nice. Marcy has one as well, and hers is in the introduction. Liability waiver. This is just something she needed to teach people what this was at some point, and she decided to do it here early because then after she provides the liability waiver, a good definition or description, she can then talk about how it's a problem and a problem that needs to be solved in the very next section. So you use this template, use the textbook and these models and all that stuff, but recognize that every once in a while you're going to have to do something in here, give people, your readers, some information. You're not going to be sure where to put it, so you've just got to make a good decision where to put that, and that's all you've got to do. All right. Otherwise, from there, though, if we keep looking at Marcy's, here's research methods, her sources in her interview. Here's some of the results. She talks about basically probably the many problems that could come up from her sources, the interview results as well, and then she put her annotated bib in here. And then we get to the two sections that I detailed previously, the conclusions and the recommendations, and we'll go from there. The only other thing I might say is if we go all the way to the end of this, a lot of people, there's your references, which you will need. The appendix. People usually put their interview questions back here, so that's a great place to put your questions. And there you go. Those are the basics. So there's just one more thing I think I'd like to show you here, and then we'll call it a video. And that is this. Here's everything we talked about, maybe in greater detail. So you can go through. Here's your many, many checklists. Just for the introduction, if we went through, here's the introduction right here, right? And everything you might say in an introduction. If we went through Marcy's, for instance, you'd see that she's answering most of these questions inside of her introduction. So you might want to do a side-by-side. This looks like a lot of bullet points, but some of these things might only be a sentence or two. So these are where your paragraph or paragraphs come from. But these are the type of things that you want to say. So just use this for what it's worth. There are a few things that you don't need in here. A letter of transmittal will not be needed. You'll need the title and the abstract and all that type of stuff. So you got lots of information here on how to do these things. Go ahead and use it, but use the student examples as well. You will need an executive summary. There's the checklist. One thing I will say in terms of length, use the student samples as a guideline for how long should my introduction be? How long should my body be? How long should my conclusion section be? Those type of things. This example from the book is way longer than yours will be, so just use the students. And the last thing I'd like to point out is just that use your book, these little marginal comments here. Use this again to help you figure out what to say. You've got your sources in your interview. You've got to turn it into a report. The best thing you can do is go through each section, say the abstract here, and say, well, what do you put into a section? What do you put into an abstract? These are essentially the types of information in the order that you put them in. So go ahead and do that. There's your executive summary. You can see I'm actually going through and labeling some things to help me out. And then as we'll start to get into the introduction, what do you say in an introduction? Well, here it is. Here's what it looks like in a paragraph. So again, use this as a checklist of what to say, or a way to generate all of the ideas that you need. Because you will have to sit down and write this, and you're going to think, oh my gosh, what do I say first? Well, you don't have to think about that. You don't have to worry about that. You've got your answers right here. These are the things, and this is a great order to say them in. Every once in a while, you may get stuck and wonder what to say or how much is too much to say. But in general, if you use these marginal guidelines here, you're going to be in good shape. All right. So I will leave it at that. Good luck with this report. If you need anything, of course, catch me in class or after class or during office hours. We will see you all soon.